Hey guys, welcome to another edition of the College Football DFS Live Before a Lock. I know I'm not Ben, but hopefully I can fill in his shoes. It's going to be a fun slate. We got a 3-game Friday night slate to get to, and I'm joined by Matt Gajewski. As always, he's the man, the myth, the legend. His projections are awesome. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing great. I'm excited for tonight's slate. Thank you for the kind words as well, Jordan. Appreciate it.
Hey man, you've been killing college football all year, so hopefully we can get this slate underway. Beforehand, let's get to some prize picks. We got some great values in my opinion. Based off of your projections, I'm seeing the FIU quarterback and Chris Reynolds, or the Charlotte quarterback. Their props on prize picks are too low for the passing yards. Do you have any thoughts on, how you feel about the FIU and Charlotte football game passing wise?
Yeah, I think it's just a little bit underpriced. And I mean, that game comes in with a high total overall. It's north of 60. And FIU in particular is passing 55% of the time. I think it does set up for some back and forth affair. And Charlotte's not a pass first team, but they're still fairly balanced. I mean, they have a 46% pass rate. And again, with the total that high, I do think that makes some sense. There's a number of spots I think we can get to, though. If Jerome Ford gets a full workload, I find it pretty hard to believe he will not eclipse his 94.5 rushing yards. And there's a couple spots like that.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at FIU's pass defense, they're giving up 344 yards a game, 9 yards per attempt. Charlotte might not even need to have the highest of volumes to hit over 248 passing yards, I believe. Yeah, no, 222. Sorry, mistake both of those quarterbacks up. But I think there's just fantastic plays on prize picks and just overall in the slate. I mean, let's get into do you have any other prize picks that you want to mention before we get into the slate?
No, I think those are a couple good ones. I'm kind of interested in the under and Alec Pierce, but I know we'll talk about him a little bit later.
Yeah. So let's get into the first game. We've got Temple taking on Cincinnati. Cincinnati is 30-point favorites, and the over-under in that one is 54. Assuming we're going to have a lot of interest in the Cincinnati side, but they don't exactly give volume to their players, which is one of the annoying parts. Who interests you on the Cincinnati side, Matt?
Their 41.5 point implied team total is really hard to get away from one way or another. You mentioned that sometimes they will take their foot off the gas in games, which they have shown in the past. They've already done this year. They have played a couple competitive games recently, but even going back 4 weeks, Jerome Ford just had 12 carries in a game that they just blew out their opponents. But with a 41 total, we need to target some of these players. And certainly for cash game builds, this is going to be a staple of your lineups just with an enormous implied team total. Ritter, for that reason, he's involved on the ground. He's efficient through the air, averaging 261 yards on 29 attempts. That's all solid and gives him a very good floor for cash games. Like you mentioned, a little bit concerned with the ceiling, but it honestly is not going to take Ritter a lot to get there, even at his elevated price. So this is a guy that rushed for 12 touchdowns on the ground last year, just very active in every phase of the game. And I think he's a player you punch right into your cash lineups. And Ford in the backfield's had a phenomenal workload too. He has at least 17 carries in 3 straight games. He's been somewhat involved in the pass game. And again, they haven't really needed to use him there because they haven't trailed at all this year. So it's something I think where you want to take a stab on both of those guys in cash games, and in tournaments, you could certainly stack it. It's just tough to decide which receiver is going to see volume.
Yeah, and I mean, you have Ritter projected 12 carries, which is fantastic for
that includes sacks. So
yes,
I want to just make that clear first and foremost. It's not like NFL carries, especially like sacks are counted for negative rushing yards in college football. So when it's carries, that includes designed runs, scrambles, and sacks.
Mm-hmm. And for Ritter, like, again, he can get there on the ground. Like, he doesn't need a ton of volume because he can just be utilized in the red zone, which is huge. Any players on Temple you're particularly looking at to run it back in these Cincy stacks?
Yeah, just breaking down the Temple side, 12.5 point implied team total, not a spot you want to get a lot of. And I don't think you're playing any of these guys in cash games. But first thing, we just had Randall Jones news. He's not warming up. He's functioning as a top 2 receiver for this team when healthy. So his absence is big. That is just going to open up opportunities for Jose Barbin, Jaden Blue, who was their leading receiver last year. Jaden Blue was banged up heading into this game, but he's out there warming up. It looks like he's going to give it a go. And he did last week too. He had 12 targets coming back from the injury, which is positive. And then Purdue transfer Ahmad Anderson is the player that stepped up in place of Randall Jones in their most recent game. He ran the most routes. So Ahmad Anderson, I think, is somebody you can look to. But ultimately, with Jaden Blue just 200 more, he's the preferred run back if you're stacking Cincinnati. There's not too much to say from the quarterback position or the running back position. Dwan Mathis is a low upside kind of player. Volume's on his side. He does throw the ball 34 times per game. But I think it just comes down to, do you really want to throw into the teeth of this Cincinnati defense with Kobe Bryant, Sauce Gardner? I would think avoiding Mathis outside of just like the biggest tournaments makes sense. And then in the backfield, it's just this timeshare between Edward Sadie, Tavon Ruley, and they listed Ravon Bonner, a transfer who entered the program this year, as the direct backup this week. So even Ravon Bonner might see an elevated workload. And just before we move on from this game, we kind of glossed over Cincinnati's receivers. Alec Pierce and Michael Young are the top two options. There's a wide discrepancy in price between them, but Pierce has 22 targets on the year to Young's 18. Those are the top two stacking options with Ritter. If you do go that route, they're rotating tight ends and rotating the wide receiver three between Trey Tucker, Tyler Scott, Jaden Thompson, Josh Wiley, Leonard Taylor. It's just a nasty rotation. So I think you're sticking with Pierce or Young outside of crazy builds, but that was a lot of information. What do you make of the Temple side?
The Temple side, I actually have interest in Jaden Blue because the last time that they played, he managed 10 for 130. Obviously, it was 2 years ago because these teams had their game canceled by COVID. I think he's just a player who can make plays against Cincy. I don't think he's going to be very popular, and I don't think this game is something that you need to go heavy on. I think for GPP specifically, I'm actually leaning away of playing multiple Cincy players. I'm looking to try to just get one of Jerome Ford or even just going Ritter by himself, because in those first two games, no receiver got over 4 targets, and they had 5 receivers manage 5 targets. Like, this is an ugly, ugly spread in these types of games. I think the targets become more concentrated when they play in more competitive games, and this isn't projected to be one. The Temple side of things, as you touched, I'm not touching their running backs. Cincy's defense is definitely going to show out. They always do. But for their receivers, I think you can take a stab at one of them because they're priced cheaply, and with Jaden Blue, you can fit them into your builds, no problem.
Yeah, what you're really hoping for on Temple side is that Cincinnati gets up in this game and then you just get some really cheap PPR volume. There's a very low chance of scoring, but maybe a guy like Jaden Blue or Jose Barban can rack up like 8 catches on little dump offs and screens and short underneath routes when Cincinnati's playing more off coverage later in the game. I think that's really what you're hoping for. But for tournaments, just a strategical kind of thing. I think you're comfortable running out some of these Cincy players with no run backs if you're doing it in tournaments. And I think you're in cash games, Ritter and Jerome Ford are going to be heavily owned. I would try to play those two. But outside of just Ritter and Ford, I think there isn't really going to be another player on Cincinnati that draws a lot of ownership.
Yeah, and moving forward to the game, I think we'll be talking about probably the most tonight. You have Charlotte 3.5-point favorites against FIU, with the over/under being the highest on the slate, 60.5 points. I really, really like this game. Matt, from the passing side of things, Charlotte, they're pretty concentrated in their targets. How are you looking to stack these receivers?
Yeah, this is a great game overall for passing volume, I think, on both sides. And Charlotte, they don't run a ton of plays per game, but they are still fairly balanced with their pass rate, 46%, like we mentioned at the beginning of the show. You mentioned the phenomenal matchup they have. FIU has a horrific defense. They're not good against the run or the pass, 344 yards allowed through the air, 211.5 on the ground. Reynolds, their quarterback, is a premier dual threat. This is a guy that had 791 rushing yards as a sophomore. Last year's season was shortened for Reynolds, so we didn't really get to see the full upside, but it's a guy that does have this elite mobility, which makes him a fantastic play on both platforms. He's going to exploit both the matchup on the ground and through the air. You asked about stacking. When we are stacking Reynolds, there's two clear options for this team in Victor Tucker and Grant DuBose. Tucker was widely regarded as the wide receiver 1 to open the year, and he still has out-targeted DuBose 36-33 on the season. But DuBose has been a little more efficient. He's averaging 78 yards per game to Tucker's 68. I think you can buy low on Tucker here, especially on FanDuel, where he's 7,300 and DuBose is 9,100. There's only a 200 price difference between them on DraftKings, so I'm a little more likely to actually play DuBose there. But I think you can play both in stacks with Reynolds. Once you get behind them, it's kind of difficult to target anybody. They rotate players a little more. Taylor Thompson, their tight end, he's out there for a decent amount of work, but his routes kind of just pale in comparison to the aforementioned Dubose and Tucker. And outside of those two, I mean, Elijah Spencer, his route rate's 48%. I don't think you really want to target any of the ancillary players for this Charlotte team.
Yeah, and I mean, like the ADOT for Dubose is just a little bit higher. I prefer him just because he's getting targeted a little bit farther down the field, and this FIU team is just very, very bad on that side of the ball. It's definitely fun to stack. They're going to be a popular stack during tournaments, in my opinion. And also what we're showing, you got DeBose 53% projected ownership, while Victor Tucker's 39%, which makes it a little bit interesting on DraftKings to go to Tucker instead to take a little bit of ownership. On the FIU side of the ball, I'm pretty interested in stacking this cheap quarterback in Bortenschlager because I just think that they're going to be throwing a lot and they're going to be in a game that's actually going back and forth. How are you approaching FIU's passing offense?
I think he's a good stacking option for tournaments specifically. In cash games, I think you just pay the extra $600 to get up to Jaden Daniels if you're trying to make that decision. But between the quarterbacks we've already listed and then Daniels, who we'll talk about in a second, I think Bortenschlager comes in easily with the lowest ownership, giving you potential leverage if this game shoots out, which it looks like there's a decent chance of based on the totals in the game. Bortenschlager, unfortunately, is a complete negative on the ground. He has negative 66 cumulative rushing yards. So he is a guy that is somewhat reliant on the 300-yard bonus to get you there in tournaments, and particularly so tonight because we have such good options at the quarterback position. But averaging 274 passing yards is very efficient. He throws the ball downfield 9.5 yards per attempt. He's reached or eclipsed 259 yards in 4 of his 5 games this year. The only time he didn't was against Texas Tech, who's a kind of a different level of competition for Bortenschlager. All that culminates to say I think he's solid for tournaments.
Yeah, and I mean, his receiving options, you got Tyrese Chambers, Bryce Singleton, and Shamar Thornton, who I think are the 3 best plays. But Tyrese Chambers, his average depth of target this year is 21.8. And it just basically screams he's just going to get your Hollywood Brown in the NFL, if you're more familiar with that. And I think just since he's not capable of running the ball by any means, you got to pair him with 2 receivers for him to get there. And I think Tyrese Chambers and Bryce Singleton are the receivers to do it. But I also have the interest in their running back. You got Price against this Charlotte defense that is giving up over 6 yards a carry and 277 rushing yards a game. Are you playing Price in cash, or are you just going cheaper at running back with some of the other plays?
Yeah, I think he's a strong play in cash. He's been used heavily, regardless of game script. Even games they're losing, he's still getting a solid workload. He averages 17.4 opportunities per game, fairly efficient as well, 80.5 rushing yards on the ground. They're not really using any of the backups. I thought they might, like Sean Peterson, Lexington Joseph. Those guys they just haven't been a factor. So Price exploits that matchup. He's also somewhat active in the pass game. He has 11 targets on the year, which keeps him viable in all game scripts. Solid for Price. I think you can definitely play him in cash. And he's a run back on the Charlotte side, if you're stacking Charlotte, that I'm also okay with just because of how active he is in all game scripts. And before we move on, one last thing I want to touch on. I think the Charlotte backs are going to be very under-owned. Shadrack Bird and Calvin Camp. It's basically a 50-50 timeshare between the two. They're both at 4.5K or lower on DraftKings. And FIU is also allowing over 210 rushing yards per game on the ground. They do not have as large of a workload as, of course, the Cincinnati backs, the Devontae Price, or even the Arizona State backs. But for that reason and their price tag, I think they'll come in really low owned.
Yeah, and I want to make everybody aware, just because he's a running back and you're playing the pass catchers on one side of the game means nothing for college football. I think the example you give all the time is someone taking down a GPP playing, I think, Slavis and 3 USC receivers.
That was on a main slate too. That, like, on short slates, anything goes, but that was on a main slate where that happened.
Yeah, no, it's definitely one of those things that you like. College football, you can build your lineups in a lot of unique ways, don't be afraid to just play with your gut in that sense. Like it it doesn't have to make sense comparative to like your NFL games where you're not playing certain guys in certain lineups because it just doesn't really make sense. But moving on, we have the
Yeah.
last.
One last thing on that before we like leave. This game we're talking about is a 61 point total. NFL games never get that high. And when you have wide spreads and implied team totals of 41 and a half points, like you can take on some negative correlation between your quarterback and running back because they're going to score so many raw points. So that's not a strategy I want to do with like Temple, but with good teams, you can certainly take on negative correlation. Or like the Slovis example, I can't remember who they played. It obviously turned into a shootout, but they ended up just scoring so many more points than all of the other teams in the slate that the triple stack worked for whatever reason. It was a crazy slate.
It's just, I mean, those receivers are pretty high caliber as well. But moving on, we got the last game of the slate. It's the 10:30 start time. Stanford and Arizona State. Arizona State is 13-point favorites. The over/under is 52 and a half. And I mean, Stanford's coming off their biggest win of the year against Oregon. I was shocked to see that Arizona State's coming in at 13-point favorites. I thought it would be a little bit lower. How are you approaching this game from a DFS standpoint?
This is another spot I think you can take contrarian stacks, and I think tournaments are the way to approach the game, unless you're just using a Stanford piece as a run back to Arizona State stacks. Their implied team total is just 19, so it's still a little bit low in the context of the slate, but Stanford's a really pass-heavy team. They pass the ball 54% of the time. They're very slow this year, 59 plays per game. That is an anomaly, and I think this will regress positively. It comes from a couple really slow games to start the year, but their pace has already started trending up, and they're a team that averaged 71 and a half plays per game last year, and that's something that didn't, like, this shouldn't change for any reason. They have a lot of continuity in their coaching staff. They shouldn't be among the slowest teams in the country this year. The only problem I have with that is Arizona State will play very slow and ball control themselves, so I'm not expecting a lot of plays overall in the game. As far as stacking Stanford, McKee is somewhat mobile. He will have volume on his side at times, but rather than stack McKee, I'm more likely to just use the Stanford piece as a run back. And they don't have Bryson Tremaine anymore. He's out for some period of time with an injury. Elijah Higgins is going to be the wide receiver one now. He has a 22% target share. That should increase without Tremaine. And then the players that get elevated from Tremaine's injury are John Humphreys, who's 4,100 on DraftKings. And then tight end Benjamin Eurosek should see a more consistent role. He's a really interesting player too. Like Eurosek is a tight end. They use him a little bit as an H-back sometimes. Like he's a couple carries like occasionally. So Eurosek has been really involved. He came off an injury last week, returned for 3 targets. So I'm expecting more of a step forward for him too.
That's interesting. I had no idea who Yursek was personally. I hadn't watched any of the Stanford games. I caught a little bit of the Oregon game last week, but not too much. This game doesn't really scream to me like the game that you should be kind of stacking. I think that you can definitely take one of the pieces from this Stanford side of things and play Jayden Daniels. And the funny thing, like the best thing about Jayden Daniels is I think you can run him naked in tournaments and be totally fine with it, because he's so good on the ground and they use him like that. Are you comfortable with fading Rachaad White, or are you trying to find a way to be playing it?
It's just, I think there's 4 premier backs on the slate. So obviously we can only play 3. Rachaad White kind of just is the player that ends up not in my lineup because of price on DraftKings. He's much easier to play on FanDuel. He's in my FanDuel cash lineup, but on DraftKings, he's a little harder to get to with DeMonte Trayanum just so much cheaper down there. I love Rachaad White's involvement in the pass game. He's actually their leading target getter among receivers. He just ends up, based on the way I built my lineup today, he ends up being like a really hard player, a really hard decision that I had to make, and I had to leave him out. But very interested in him in tournaments. The workload's fantastic. Obviously, with Trayanum back, it's going to be a little bit lower, but he still has an elite ceiling, especially against the Stanford defense, just giving up points on the ground, 215 yards per game. And while we're on the running backs, Trayanum coming back 16 carries in their last game. He's just flat out too cheap on DraftKings. FanDuel too for that reason, but salary's a little more loose over there.
Yeah, and also on FanDuel, you're playing 2 running backs and no flex. Well, sorry, you got the super flex, but should be playing 2 quarterbacks, especially on this slate with the ability on the ground. But on the Arizona receiving side of things, do you have any interest in these guys, or is it just kind of stay away from it because they have a running back leading them in targets this year?
I think the stack is going to be a little more contrarian. And one positive thing to say, and I mean, it's not positive, but Johnny Wilson's out with a hamstring injury. A positive in the fact that I think it condenses targets for some of these receivers. Like Ricky Pearsall, he should operate as the clear wide receiver one. Unfortunately, he's 6,200, so you have to make some tough decisions with him. Do you play like DuBose or Tucker or Pearsall, whose volume is going to be a little more volatile, but he has a lot of upside given the state of Arizona State's offense? I think the next most consistent player is Curtis Hodges. A little more comfortable stacking him because I think a lot of people are going to gravitate to the Shamar Thorntons and the Euroseks and the John Humphreys and the cheap players there. And then you have Curtis Hodges as the second most consistent route runner, 77% route rate for him, but he's just not targeted as much. So for GPP specifically, if you're stacking Daniels, he's a player I like. After that, it's just roll the dice on Andre Johnson, Brian Thompson, LB Bunkley Shelton. Their routes are so volatile week to week. Like they're hard to project because of how different they are on a per game basis.
Yeah, no, I'm looking at these numbers. It's
all over the place.
It's absolutely ugly, and it doesn't really make much sense to me. I'm just like, you just see them. But I think that I'm personally going to be probably playing Andre Johnson because of his price. It's just he fit into my build, but I think you don't really have to pair a receiver with Jaden Daniels because again, he does it on the ground. A lot of these quarterbacks on this slate do it on the ground. That's why I'm mainly targeting the Charlotte FIU game for me because I'm a more so GPP player. I don't play cash. But any other remarks that you think we should get to before we start to close this thing out and get this show on the road?
I think we hit on most of the players. Stanford's running backs, I'm not really too interested in. They are involved in the pass game, but I mean, they're going to have to perform so well to eclipse all four of the elite backs. And then I think even the Charlotte backs are better GPP plays than the Stanford backs. So they're way down on the list for me. But I guess if you guys have questions in the chat, feel free to fire those. Any stones you think we left unturned, Jordan? Anything we missed?
I mean, I think for lineup construction wise, I think it is for me. I'm fading Desmond Ridder in my GPP lineup. I think that FIU quarterback is like one of the plays for me. I think could make me more unique because he's projected 16% ownership and he's 6,300, and pairing him with these FIU receivers will help get me there. And the Charlotte game is the game that I'm going after. But for Stanford, I don't, I'm not sure I'm going to get to them or really out Temple players outside of Jaden Blue just because of the historic part of it. Those teams are projected under 20 points while everybody else is projected 28 or above. So any questions in the chat? We got Ritter on FanDuel. Is that something that you could be going towards?
Yeah, he's in my cash lineup over there. I think Ritter is the safest quarterback play on both sites. He's fadeable in tournaments just because of the things you noted already about about Cincinnati at times taking their foot off the gas. So he's fadeable, and there are other good options like Chris Reynolds is a good option. Jaden Daniels is a good option. I think Bordenschlager is great in tournaments. I could even see some really contrarian lineups with McKee. So in tournaments, he is fadeable. In cash, I think you just want to play him.
And then we got Dwan Johnson or Trainum. I think you lean Trainum. I don't even have him a part of my player pool, Dwan Johnson. So I'm not
I mean, he might be Dwan Mathis.
Okay. And I would play
I would play Trainum between the two.
And I'm not trying to choose between a running back and a quarterback in most of my lineups. I prefer to stick to two quarterbacks at that position. The next one is best 3,600 or under flex in the DK GPP. For me personally, I have it as Shamar Thornton. What about you, Matt?
I think Thornton's going to be heavily owned. So I would pivot to, if this is for big tournaments specifically, and not knowing the rest of your lineup, knowing Thornton's going to be a little bit owned, I would consider Benjamin Eurosek for Stanford, a heavily used tight end. But it all depends on the rest of your construction. If you're heavier on Arizona State, I'd probably play Eurosek. If you're heavier on the Charlotte FIU game, I would lean your direction with Thornton.
Pierce or Tucker. I lean Alec Pierce, but I really don't want to pay up for it. But if I'm choosing between the two, I'll just go with Pierce because he's just a better player and he can have the big play. How about you, Matt?
if salary is not an option or doesn't matter, I would agree with you. But I think Tucker's the better price adjusted play.
Yeah, and then the next one we have is Ford or train them in GPPs. Ford for GPPs. I know because if you can afford Ford, you just play him because I think he's one going to be super popular, and two, I think Cincinnati's just going to kind of run the ball, not try to do too much. But with Ford against Temple's defense, I think with 20 carry or 15 carries, he's able to get over 100 yards rushing. They've been giving him the ball a ton. How about you, Matt?
I agree with you 100%. I like Ford a lot in that situation.
Yeah, no, it's this slate is the 3-game slate isn't as fun as the Saturday main slate. It's a lot shorter, but Purcell or one of the two Charlotte receivers in cash, I lean the Charlotte receivers.
Same.
Both of them are much better plays in my opinion.
I agree with you.
Just so you guys know, if you are listening and you want to get access to this college football live or college football content, if you use the code CFBLBL you'll get a 25% off coupon for your first week of the Awesemo Platinum or Plus Platinum. Or if you just want the college football package, you can get it as low as $14.95 for the week. It's fantastic. Matt has projections on targets, receptions, yards. Like, these projections are one of a kind and something that helped me win 55K last season and got me started onto being able to play more and more college football. Matt, as always, I appreciate you coming on. I'm glad you brought your popcorn. It's important that we hopefully take down the GPP today.
Yeah, man, I'm ready. I've been excited for this slate. The slates are getting bigger and they're getting more frequent. We have a Tuesday slate next week. It's a showdown slate, but I'm excited for more football overall.
Yeah, no, I feel like I've been playing these college football slates way too much, but hey, it's fun. Last night was Isaiah Likely night, and I had him. I decided to not go Shamar Jones because he burned me, and I greatly regret it. It's all good, but appreciate you guys. Hopefully you guys got some answers, and hopefully someone takes down the GPP. Have a good one.